University and president of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. He specializes in economic sovereignty and climate finance in the Global South, focusing on just transitions and sustainable development. Dr. Kaboub has advised initiatives like the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty and Power Shift Africa. He recently co-authored Just Transition, a Climate, Energy and Development Vision for Africa. Based in Nairobi, he is dedicated to transforming global trade, finance, and investment systems for equitable growth. So today, Dr. Kaboub is going to tell us, or to try to address the question, can Tunisia reset the conversation about debt, development, and climate finance? And as a climate vulnerable V20 member facing climate and economic challenges, Tunisia has a chance to lead strategic South-South and South-North cooperation to transform energy, climate, debt, and development. Under the G77, Tunisia can push for geopolitical leverage to advance debt, development, and climate finance conversations with the global North. From an African perspective, climate finance equals development finance, creating opportunities to invest in food sovereignty, agroecology, and renewable infrastructure. Tunisia demands climate debt repayment through grants, technology transfer, and debt cancellation, not rescheduling. All these ideas, the floor is yours, Dr. Kaboub, to develop them. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for hosting this conversation. If I use the slides, this will move?
Okay. It's coming, it's coming.
Oh, it's coming, okay.
Yeah.
Maybe to answer the question earlier about why is Tunisia not requesting even funds from the Green Climate Fund or other adaptation funds where we actually qualify for funding, for almost grant-based financing. And I think what's lacking in Tunisia is understanding that climate finance is development finance, and understanding that climate negotiations are not exclusively about climate or reducing emissions. They're about development. They're about technology transfer. They're about foreign direct investment in transformative sectors. So we need Tunisia's presence here not to be from the Ministry of Environment alone, but Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Ministry of Finance in particular, including the central bank. There's green central banking conversations that are happening as we speak. So I think it requires thinking about this particular process, the COP process, at the cabinet level rather than particular ministries or sub-ministries. So with that, I'd like to start the conversation by highlighting this report, Just Transition report. It's available in French also on our website, which was published last year by the Independent Expert Group on Just Transition and Development. And what we try to do in this report is put forward a coherent and comprehensive long-term transformative strategy from an African perspective that simultaneously addresses climate, energy, and development issues. These are issues that are usually siloed, even in our governments. When we talk about debt, we're not talking about climate. When we talk about energy, we're not talking about development. And this report was well received, and a lot of my comments today will reflect this work. Why long-term strategy from a Tunisian perspective, from an African perspective? If you as a country or as a region don't have a strategic vision for yourself, I guarantee you're already part of somebody else's vision. And everybody has a right to have a strategic vision for themselves. They have a right to use their economic diplomacy and incentives to nudge every other country to where they want to see them. But so do we. We also have the right to have our vision, to use our diplomacy to reposition ourselves where we think we should be. The problem is that most of the major economic blocs already have a vision for us, have a particular role for us that was assigned for centuries now. And that is, we're supposed to be the place where they can extract cheap raw materials from the global south in general for their industries, where the consumers of industrial output and technologies from the global north. We still play that role today as a continent and as a country. And most importantly, we're the place, and this is especially true for Tunisia, we're the place where obsolete technologies, assembly line manufacturing that they no longer need in the industrialized world, it's outsourced to us under the label of foreign direct investment, cooperation, job creation, partnerships. But effectively what it does, it locks us at the bottom of the global value chain. And that is a structural trap. So we're not going to have a just transition or achieve the SDGs or deliver any of the important goals that we're trying to achieve under a system that's still structurally imposing this particular economic role. And that's a colonial role. And we have to, I don't think we have to convince anybody that colonial structures were not designed for justice or development or democracy or any of the good things. So why do we expect the same economic structures to produce a just transition or development or SDGs? They can't by design. So that's why we always talk about you can't really decarbonize a system unless it's also structurally decolonized. And when it comes to the specific structural traps that we have in Tunisia and Africa and the rest of the global south, high external debt is usually the symptom that everybody observes. But the sources of external debt are three major categories, and this reflects also Tunisia's economy, as you will see in a minute. Energy deficits, food deficits, and manufacturing value-added deficits. And no country can function without food, without energy. This is the foundation. And if you're hoping to have prosperity, you have to have industry. And we have deficiencies in the key areas. I'll give you an example. The energy sector in Africa. We're talking about the old energy system, the fossil fuel system. Our largest oil exporters, Nigeria, Angola, are energy deficient. They export crude oil, they import gasoline and kerosene and petrochemicals, and are energy poor and are set up typically in a debt trap. The continent as a whole, our food imports is 85% of our food is imported. In Tunisia, of course, you know the huge food imports for the grains, the core food items. And then the manufacturing base that we are allowed to have in the global south with trade agreements and partnerships is the kind where you have to import the machines, you have to import the fuel to power the factories, you have to import the intermediate components to be assembled with low-cost labor, and we even import the packaging. So you end up with a manufacturing sector that produces low value-added content for exports, and what we import is high value-added content. So we can double, triple, quadruple our exports. You're always locked at the bottom of the hierarchy. You can't escape that trap. So the strategic transformation that we need in Tunisia and the African continent in general is based on the structural problems. So strategic investments in food sovereignty and agroecology, strategic investments in renewable energy, which is our biggest potential. There's becoming very obvious that there is no other alternative than renewables, especially in Tunisia, and real industrial policies to escape the bottom of the value chain. So high value-added manufacturing, starting with manufacturing the building blocks of development and prosperity, which is renewable energy infrastructure, clean transportation infrastructure, high-tech equipment, so that we're not locked in the same structural trap. But the problem with these trade deficits, and you'll recognize Tunisia's current economic crisis in this, is that when you have structural trade deficits year after year, the value of our currency becomes weaker relative to the dollar and relative to the euro. And with the weaker currency, anything we need to import the next morning, food, fuel, medicine, we import it at a higher price. So we literally import inflation in the most sensitive areas, food, fuel, and medical equipment. And that means you have the potential for social instability and economic instability. So our government immediately rearranges its priorities to protect the most vulnerable people. So we subsidize food, we subsidize fuel, we try our best to subsidize health services, but that's unsustainable to do this for 50, 60, 70 years because we're not solving the problem, we're just using band-aid solutions. And we also ask our central bank to defend the exchange rate, to strengthen the exchange rate. And the central bank will do it by borrowing more dollars and therefore feeding into the debt cycle. And when you get unsustainable debt, external debt in dollars and euros, eventually you have to completely rearrange your economic priorities to prioritize extractive economic activity. so that you earn dollars as quickly as possible. And you neglect the strategic investments that will actually get you out of this trap. And you'll see this on a global scale. If you divide the world in global north and global south, and net out all global financial transactions, we get that green line, which the last data point is showing that the global north is extracting $2 trillion from the global south in net transactions. This includes foreign direct investment, trade, remittances from workers, even illicit financial flows. The net amount is purely extractive. And notice the green line is accelerating. It's not new, it's structural. So that's the global economic architecture that needs to be transformed, not reformed. And when we say global economic architecture, it's a trade architecture, investment architecture, that's the WTO, financial architecture, that's the World Bank and IMF, and taxation architecture, which for a long time was in the hands of the OECD. Now we're moving the taxation, international taxation, into the UN system. It's being negotiated as we speak. This is a colonial economic architecture. So we shouldn't be surprised to see that it's actually extractive and that it continues to be extractive from the global south. And to summarize, since this is Climate Finance Day, to summarize where we are in climate finance, you have $2 trillion moving in the wrong direction from the global south to the global north. You have $100 billion promised from 15 years ago. Most of what was delivered was loans, not grants. You have the Green Climate Fund, last time I checked, had $12 billion for the entire global south. It's very difficult actually to get funding from it. That's one of the reasons Tunisia is, I was talking to the Uganda delegation. They worked for 3 years just to qualify for applying for Green Climate Fund. 3 years of doing papers. And then you have that tiny little dot there, if you can see it. That's the loss and damage fund. That's 700, and they added $19 million yesterday. So now it's $719 million. And of course, the big extractive industries, the fossil fuel industry that is, you can't find a green climate fund that can match the annual profits of these oil and gas companies in Africa. So that's the problem. This is the summary of climate. That's why we're not making any progress. Because if you're taking $2 trillion from me every year, and you give me $719 million in loss and damage fund, it doesn't really make any impact. And you promise $100 billion, and all of it is loans to get you in a debt trap. You're not going to make any progress on this. So this is the picture for the African continent as a whole. You can see Africa's exports, raw materials mostly, right, and cash crops. So coffee, tea, tobacco, cocoa. And notice the volume of Africa's exports in billions of dollars. Now notice the volume of our imports. So we have a structural trade deficit on a continental scale. And notice our imports is high value added products, pharmaceutical products, core crops, rice, wheat, corn, and refined petrochemicals. We export the crude, we re-import the more expensive version of it. This is the data for Tunisia. I can show you country after country after country, very similar picture. Notice the volume of Tunisia's exports, and now notice the volume of Tunisia's imports. So we have a structural trade deficit year after year after year, which is the reason why the dinar is getting weaker and weaker relative to the dollar. I'll go back again to Tunisia's exports. You notice you can eyeball the composition of what we export, and you can eyeball the composition of what we import. Wheat, cars, pharmaceutical products, refined petrochemicals, and so on. So this produces this constant pressure on the exchange rate. So when the line is going up, that's the dinar getting weaker relative to the dollar. That's the dollar becoming more expensive. Notice it's not because of a particular moment or particular crisis. It's not just because of COVID. It's not just because of the revolution. It's not just because of any particular president or prime minister. It's a structural issue. Of course, international crises and governments matter, policy choices, but this is structural. And the result of it is this external debt that is increasing exponentially, debt in dollars and euros and so on. So the structural solutions, as I indicated earlier, And I emphasize that the structural solutions cannot be Tunisia-based. They have to be at least regional economic cooperation, if not Pan-African, for a very simple reason, which is the third category, high value-added manufacturing. No industrialization can happen on a small scale. You need economies of scale. And we are an economy of 11 million consumers. So we can't industrialize because we don't have an internal market. We have a global market, but good luck competing today with made in Germany, made in Japan, made in China. But if you look towards the African continent, here's what we have for regional or Pan-African cooperation. You have the complementarity of resources and capabilities. You have the economies of scale. We're the size of China. And you have all the critical raw materials that we need on the continent, not in Tunisia, but on the African continent, to manufacture and deploy renewable energy infrastructure, clean cooking infrastructure, which is a huge market for the African continent. 950 million people don't have any access to clean cooking infrastructure. That's an industrialization opportunity. It's not a high-tech equipment that we're talking about. And then clean transportation infrastructure, not to manufacture batteries for European and American EVs, but to manufacture solar panels. We don't have electricity. Why are we producing batteries for other people? So it's about the industrial priorities also. And of course, food sovereignty and renewable energy sovereignty, as I'll show you later. And of course, we have to continue fighting for transforming the global economic architecture. So doing the first part in and of itself is not sufficient. We still have to fight to undo the economic architecture that I described earlier. So in terms of the climate debt concept, some countries have clearly exceeded their carbon budget. That's the global north. Our countries, Tunisia included, we didn't exceed our carbon budget. So from a scientific perspective, the countries that exceeded their carbon budget, they owe a climate debt. And the concept of debt is very simple. In economics and law and finance, if I owe you $100, I have to pay you $100. We can negotiate the payment plan, but it has to be a payment without you taking anything from me. But unfortunately today, this is not how climate finance works. So the global north has essentially appropriated the atmospheric commons, and it has a climate debt, and there's estimates about the amount of climate debt that we're talking about. This study by Fanning and Hickel estimates that it's 193 trillion to be paid between now and 2050. And I'll show you some of the data. So the countries in the green area didn't exceed their budget. Notice that China and India are still there. Technically speaking, China and India are today huge emitters, but in terms of cumulative emissions, they were developing countries, they were poor countries for a long time. They didn't industrialize until recently. And most of their industrialization today is to produce stuff to be consumed in the US and Europe. So notice the rest of the global south is in the green area. So it's very simple methodology here. And this is the summary of the climate reparations or climate debt framework. Even if you exclude China and India from this, let's say they're not getting any climate reparation, the rest of the global south is still owed trillions of dollars, not billions, not millions. So this should be the foundation for the negotiations that are happening today. But of course, the global north doesn't want to talk about reparations or even grants or public funding for climate adaptation. They want us in the global south to de-risk investments for private companies from the global north to come extract and greenwash their economic activity, and they call that climate finance. And that's very, very problematic. And you've probably seen this campaign and with a lot of civil society groups here asking for, based on that study, it means $5 trillion per year at least. And it has to be in the form of debt cancellation, at least debt cancellation of all debts related to climate-related borrowing, and not restructuring or rescheduling. Grants, not loans, and transfer of technology. This is very important for the economic transformation. Transfer of technology, not all technologies, but technology that what we call life-saving technology, to manufacture and deploy renewables infrastructure, clean cooking infrastructure, and clean transportation infrastructure in order to transform our economies. And this is economic transformation, but all of this is climate adaptation. And this is just to highlight the massive potential that we have on the African continent. According to IRENA, Africa today can produce 1,000 times its anticipated energy needs by 2040. 1,000 times, and become a massive economic and energy powerhouse globally. And this is the distribution of critical minerals. All the critical minerals that we need for real industrial policies are on the African continent. And Tunisia's responsibility in this, or opportunities, that we do have the research and development capabilities, the manufacturing capabilities. We don't have any of the resources, but that's where complementary comes in. And we're a small economy, but we have huge renewable energy opportunity, not just for us, but for our neighbors on the African continent and our neighbors in Europe. But what is the kind of renewable energy investment that we see in Tunisia? Purely extractive, importing all the infrastructure with loans from European banks to produce solar energy and green hydrogen to be exported to Europe. So it's a greenwash, rinse and repeat of the same extractive colonial approach, when we could be manufacturing the infrastructure, producing it for ourselves, and exporting the surplus. And that requires cooperation. The same problem exists in every single country on the African continent. In fact, the problem is worse in other countries because they have all the resources and they have no capabilities to add value and manufacture and so on. So this is where cooperation comes in. So to conclude, the time to act is now. We need radical policy action, not incremental solutions. And this is where, going back to what I said in the beginning, these are decisions at the cabinet level. So president and ministers having a structural conversation about the economy, and then recognizing that, okay, now we agree as a country, as a political leadership, that we're going to undertake this work. And now we have to do the diplomatic work to engage with our neighbors across the continent so that they too have similar conversations and start moving towards South-South cooperation of this kind. And when I say Pan-Africanism and South-South cooperation, I'm going to just put the conclusions here. I don't mean it as a nice things we say to each other in these meetings. It's an economic necessity. So Pan-African unity and Pan-African industrial policies is unavoidable if we're going to escape these structural traps. And this transformative vision is really within reach. We have all the political leverage. When we operate as a bloc in COP or any multilateral negotiations, whether it's the Africa group or the G77 or the V20, these are large blocks of countries. We're the global majority. We're 88% of the global population. So when these blocks have a coherent vision and stand behind it, they're unstoppable. So the geopolitical leverage is also available to us. And that needs to be activated. And it takes leadership, and I'm challenging the Tunisian diplomats to do this work in Tunisia and with the Africa Group and the G77. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kaboub.
Thank you.
Can you tell us, in Africa, which are the countries who are leading according to your vision?
Unfortunately, not yet. I mean, there are countries that are interested, but they're overwhelmed by the amount of work that needs to be done. So what we're interestingly, the Latin American countries are more interested in this because they're politically more ready, I think, to engage at the global South level. So you see some interest there. But on the African continent, you have countries like Uganda, which is chairing the G77 this year, the non-aligned movement. Also, countries like Namibia, the Sahel countries who are, actively trying to decolonize and reduce French influence. Those are the countries that are already interested. They want to move beyond extractivism and dependence on European extractive industries. But a lot of work needs to be done. I mean, you would think that the African Union should be the place where this is happening, but the African Union is mostly funded by the European Union. So lots of external influence in policy choices. And the problem with external debt makes it very difficult for any government to think beyond the next few months. Because Africa this year is paying $163 billion in debt service, in this year alone, in 2024. That's massive. So when you have that kind of debt burden, a country like Kenya, 50% of export revenues is to pay the debt. So what's left in your budget after you prioritize importing fuel, importing food, paying the debt? There's nothing left in your budget. So you can't think about real industrial policies. So your choices are somebody from the global north outsourcing low value added manufacturing and is offering you to set up an industry to create 500 jobs. So you take it. It's better than nothing. And you go deeper into the trap.
Thank you. Any question?
Thank you. I suppose you are following the negotiations about the NCQG.
Yes.
And so far, actually, it's very tough and it's a crisis.
Sure.
Recently, so the US opposed that any funding go to the loss and damage. What do you expect will happen by the end of this COP with this regard? Like for the...
Yeah. I'm not speaking on behalf of any government, but I try to share information with governments. I think a no deal is better than a bad deal in this COP, because there's no time to keep delaying and wait. I mean, you've seen the summary of the climate finance picture. We're not even close. So why do we keep agreeing to things that are pre-cooked by Europe and the US for the COP? Why can't we use our leverage as a bloc and say, look, this is not going to work. So we're not going to make this festival a success for you, for your media, to celebrate another successful COP. 29 COPs, that's 29 failures, right? We're not actually acting. And the countries that have been historically the most responsible for climate change are actually adding more fossil fuel infrastructure. That's the US, Canada, and continue reliance on outsourcing the heavy pollution industries to the global south, India and China and Mexico and other places. So these are delaying tactics. There's no action. And I'm talking about other US administrations, so the next one is going to be worse.
Yeah, thank you so much for this excellent presentation, which is interesting and sad at the same time. I saw in the first slide that you mentioned energy deficiency in Tunisia. It's a pity actually, with all the solar potential, the wind potential, and even the resources extracted also at the south and even offshore. So based on your experience, what is preventing Tunisia from auto-exploiting these resources, solar, wind, for example?
Yeah.
Can you give us maybe one or two main reasons for that? Is it institutional? Is it absence of public-private partnerships?
Yeah.
As per your experience, thank you.
I think it's, in Tunisia, like many other places that have the same potential, if not more potential, it's a couple of things. One, the debt burden doesn't allow you to think strategically. So you end up cornered in an economic situation where anybody from the outside that says, oh, we're going to come and invest in renewable energy, but it's going to be on terms that are favorable to us, not to you, but we'll give you a little bit of money, we end up accepting it because it's better than nothing, right? The second thing is we tend to think of this potential in the context of producing renewable energy requires importing the infrastructure. We're not thinking in terms of industrialization that allows us both to produce the renewable energy, but also to become a major manufacturer. The third thing is economic diplomacy, where we haven't been successful in negotiating deals that are favorable to us. And I'll give you an example. This is where it's important to play the geopolitics. The major interest in North Africa in general in terms of renewables is from Europe, because it makes sense. They need energy and it's very close. And it's a traditional partner. But the key player in the renewables industry today is China. It's not Europe, right? So China, when I looked up how much we consume in Tunisia, we consume 6 gigawatt. That's very small. China installs 6 gigawatt of solar and wind in 6 weeks. So in 6 weeks, we can have complete energy independence if we wanted. We don't have to negotiate a deal with China for 6 weeks. Let's do it 6 years or 16 years, right? To say we will set up a hub in Tunisia to manufacture solar panels for the entire African continent with Chinese technology and start deploying a certain percentage in Tunisia, a certain percentage in the rest of the African continent, and then bring together 5, 6, 10 other African countries and say, we're going to replicate the entire Chinese manufacturing value chain, distributed in our countries. So each country will take, 10, 15 steps of the manufacturing process, and then it's assembled and manufactured at scale, right? And deployed at scale. That's not the kind of thinking we're having. And China will be interested in this. Chinese foreign policy is always very clear. We'll never tell you what to do. We'll never interfere in your internal affairs, but we're ready to partner, share technology, finance, and they have very serious geopolitical interest in becoming more influential in a transformative way on the African continent. But they will not come to us and dictate the transformation. It's our responsibility as Tunisians, as Africans, to work on preparing the strategic plans for real industrial policies with a handful, it doesn't have to be the entire continent, just a handful of African countries, and then going with to China with the bargain for this kind of partnership and transformation. It's possible.
Thank you, Fadhel, for this very insightful presentation. Actually, I have a question regarding so the question is, should we blame ourselves before blaming the North? It's like we do have our own internal problems, even the limited resources that are offered now, we are not taking profit from them. And we do have a lot of lack of transparency, a lot of heavy administrative procedures. And so should we blame ourselves before blaming the North? That's my question.
Blame both. Right? We have responsibility for designing strategies that work for us, positioning ourselves geopolitically, strategically in an advantageous way. That's our responsibility. Nobody's going to do this for us. The report that I mentioned was written for African policymakers, and we made it very clear, if we don't have a vision for ourselves, then we'll be part of somebody else's vision, and we allow that to reproduce itself. But there's also a global architecture that's not friendly to our development, was not designed for our development, and that's another reason to cooperate, to fight, to transform the economic architecture. So it works both ways.
Yeah. I think last question. First of all, I want to say thank you for all your explanations, because you summed up a problem that we as Tunisians living in every day, and there is the type of sensibility that we don't have in the youth. I think I'm talking for the youth here. We don't understand how this country was at some point and now is going down and going down hardly in another point. Yeah. I want to thank you for that, because you helped us understand what's happening in a global structure. So now my question is, I always believe by the fact of I want to change step by step. I can't do anything, everything in one night. What's your maybe one, let's say, advice for youth like us? What can we do on the macro level or even on the micro level to help change things from your experience?
Very good. Yeah, I mean, we're talking about long-term strategic transformation, and I always say the long term starts today. The long term started yesterday, in small steps. And I give you a concrete example on the issue of food deficits that we have. Every metric ton of wheat we produce in Tunisia, which is not a lot, right? So we can actually invest with very little internal resources to produce one additional 100 metric tons, right, of wheat. That saves us the equivalent of dollars that we had to borrow to import the wheat, and interest we have to pay for the next 10, 15 years. That's one small step. And the nice thing about agriculture is 12 months. So in 12 months, you can get out of a trap. So internally today, we can put together internal resources, not requiring external finance, to carve out more land, more water resources, more seeds, more support for farmers to produce more wheat. And that's one step out of the structural trap, one step out of external debt. And it's a climate adaptation. We're reducing our carbon footprint. Same thing with renewable energy. Every green kilowatt hour we produce in Tunis saves us the equivalent of dollars we have to borrow to import gas, right? And interest we have to pay for 10, 15 years. That's a debt trap. So very small steps. Every step we move in the right direction gets us out of the trap. And then on the economic diplomacy and industrial policies, moving away from the economic entrapment of industrial policies of outsourcing assembly line manufacturing. One deal with Chinese companies to replicate the value chain can completely transform the Tunisian economy for the next 100 years. One deal, because we have all the renewable energy potential, and gives us more influence on the African continent if we become the leaders of industrial transformation on the continent. And we have this potential. We have the engineering capabilities. We have brilliant people in the diaspora who are ready to come back to real industrial policies. This is all possible. This can happen within the next 5 years if we organize.
Any question from Si Zohair or Si Lutfi? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kaboub. And you are still here next week, right?
I'm here, yeah.
Yeah, I recommend that you keep in touch with the Tunisian delegation. We have the Minister of Healthcare, who is also the advisor of our president, Mr. Qais Said, who is coming on Monday. And I think it's important that you have the opportunity to exchange with him these important ideas, not only for Tunisia, but also for Africa and for Tunisian diplomacy. So please, if you have the opportunity, same advice for Dr. Nihal Shabrak. I will request from our Tunisian delegation to organize a short meeting for both of you.
Excellent.
Okay?
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.